Abortion may be on the Nebraska ballot next year.
After months of debate this year in the Nebraska legislature that turned a 20-week abortion ban into 12 weeks, the public may have the final say.
Today, organizers released the language that will be included on petitions.
Brian Mastry is live tonight with more on its goal and how the opposition thinks it goes too far.
Aaron, organizers could be on the streets of Omaha and the rest of the state collecting signatures as early as next week. They're trying to collect 125,000 of them in 38 counties by next summer to get the issue of protecting the rights to abortion on the November 2024 ballot. We knew the organization Protect Our Rights had submitted the language to the Nebraska Secretary of State for consideration. Today, for the first time, we're seeing the words that will be on those petitions Nebraskans will be asked to sign. The petition basically says that all persons shall have a fundamental right to abortion until fetal viability without interference from the state. In the petition, fetal viability is defined as the point in pregnancy when there's a significant likelihood of the fetus's sustained survival outside the uterus without extraordinary measures. And that decision would be made by the patient's treating healthcare practitioner. Supporters tell me that in state after state, it's been clear since Roe versus Wade was overturned, a majority of voters believe these decisions are for the patient, not politicians.
Previously, we had the 20-week restrictions and it moved to the 12. And 20-week is actually arbitrary. There's no medical reason, scientific facts that support what 20-week means. It just was put in place and actually caused more barriers to care. And so fetal viability really allows for the doctor to make that decision in conjunction with that person that is accessing care.
This language is concerning to me on the basis of viability, fetal viability. They're trying to make the point that this seems reasonable. However, where it becomes more problematic for us is when you're talking about providing abortion, second and third trimester, late-term abortion, at the professional judgment of the patient's healthcare provider, which is the very person who's performing the abortion.
Based on the most recent data from Nebraska's Health and Human Services, 86% of Nebraska abortions take place up to 12 weeks of gestation, and that's where Nebraska's current law stands. John and Aaron, the Protect Our Rights group has a petition drive launch here in Omaha tomorrow afternoon. Political experts expect a lot of outside money to come into Nebraska on both sides of this issue. On your side in the newsroom, Brian Mastry, 6 News.
And since Roe was overturned last year, 7 states have put abortion up to voters. In every election in both red and blue states, voters have chosen to protect abortion rights. The most recent was just last week in Ohio, where an amendment similar to the one being proposed here was approved. The closest vote to us was in Kansas last year, where voters parted from the status quo in the conservative state.
Former